What kind of billionaire bets his future on a total stranger? And what kind of woman walks in and turns his entire empire upside down? When Richard Walker promised to marry the next woman who entered the room, he didn't expect her to be homeless. He didn't expect his career, his past, and his heart to unravel before her eyes. But what started as a reckless dare soon spiraled into a scandal that threatened to destroy everything. Stay until the end, because what she does next will shock even the man who gave her everything. What kind of man decides to marry a total stranger on a whim? And what kind of woman walks through that door to change everything he ever believed in? The Grand Oak Bistro sparkled under the Chicago skyline, golden lights flickering against tall glass windows, the clinking of crystal glasses echoing softly over whispered business deals, and laughter of the city's elite. Among them, seated in a corner booth with a view of Lake Michigan, sat Richard Walker, a man who owned half the skyline he stared at. At 45, Richard wasn't just wealthy, he was a legend. A ruthless investor turned philanthropist, the tabloids called him the Ice King of Wall Street. But if anyone looked close enough tonight, they'd see that ice beginning to crack. He swirled a glass of Bordeaux, slowly watching the dark liquid swirl like thoughts in his mind. "You've got that look again," said Daniel Hayes, his longtime attorney and only real friend. "Trouble at the firm," Richard sighed. "The business is fine. The legacy isn't." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Still hung up on the heir thing?" Richard's jaw tightened. "You know how I was raised. My father passed the company to me, his father to him, but me, I have no one." "You have Emily," Daniel reminded gently. "Your daughter is brilliant, Richard. She could—" "It's not the same." Richard snapped his voice a little too loud. Several heads turned. He forced a thin smile, lowering his voice. "I love Emily, but the board, the legacy, everything I've built. In their eyes, it needs a son, a male heir." Daniel shook his head in disapproval. "It's 2025, Richard. That thinking is outdated and cruel." "Tell that to my father's will," Richard muttered bitterly. "He left me a billion-dollar empire and a burden I can't pass on." Daniel fell silent. He'd known Richard long enough to understand the guilt about his failed marriage with Lauren, about the way he pushed her away, obsessed with continuing a name instead of building a family. Then, with a sudden spark in his eyes, Richard set his wine down. "I'm done waiting for fate to fix this," he said, voice tight with a strange kind of excitement. "Let's make things interesting." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" "A bet," Richard said, turning toward the entrance of the restaurant. "The next woman who walks through that door, I'll marry her." Daniel choked on his drink. "Are you out of your mind?" "Probably," Richard smirked. "But I've tried logic and legacy. Now I want something unpredictable. What if she's whoever she is, she'll be mine?" And then the door opened. Time seemed to freeze. A hush fell over the room as a figure stepped inside. Not a socialite in heels or a high-powered attorney, but a woman with tangled dark hair, dirt-smudged jeans, and a face both young and worn at once. She didn't belong here, and every person in the restaurant knew it. Grace Miller had no idea that walking into that restaurant would change her life. She looked around nervously, eyes wide like an animal in headlights. Her hands clutched the straps of a torn backpack. Murmurs rose. A waitress began to move toward her. So did security. But before anyone could reach her, Richard stood. "Wait," he said, voice echoing across the hushed dining room. All eyes turned to him. "I invited her." Even Daniel's mouth fell open. Richard walked straight to Grace, ignoring the gasps, the whispers. "Good evening," he said, smiling as if she were royalty. "I'm Richard Walker. Would you care to join me for dinner?" Grace looked at him like he was insane. Her eyes flicked to the security guards, then back to the man in the $1,000 suit with the outstretched hand. Her voice was cautious, husky from the cold. My name is Grace," Grace Richards said, as if tasting the word. "A beautiful name." She hesitated, then placed her calloused hand in his. Behind them, Daniel stared in stunned silence. "What the hell are you doing?" he muttered under his breath. Across the city, in a modest apartment in Lakeview, Lauren Walker sipped her coffee and read the headline on her phone. "Billionaire Richard Walker causes scene. Dines with homeless woman at Grand Oak Bistro." She blinked. "Oh, God. What did you do now, Richard?" Back at Richard's penthouse. Grace sat stiffly on a leather sofa, staring at walls covered in priceless art. "Why am I here?" she asked. "What do you want from me?" Richard sat across from her, eyes sincere. "You. I want to marry you." She stood up so fast she nearly knocked over her coffee. "What kind of twisted game is this? I'm not some joke you play to feel better about yourself." "It's not a game," Richard said quickly. "I made a vow. And you walked through that door. You don't even know me. Maybe I'd like to." Grace shook her head. This is insane. But something in his voice, something in the way he said it, didn't sound like manipulation. It sounded like a man who was tired of pretending he had everything, when inside he had nothing. Still, she wasn't ready to trust him. Not yet. Not when her entire life had taught her that nothing came without a price. Meanwhile, Lauren called someone she hadn't in months. "Daniel, it's me." "What is going on? You're not going to believe this," he said grimly. "He's serious. He's really doing it." Doing what? He's marrying her, Lauren, a woman he met last night. Lauren's breath caught. For a moment, the world tilted. She didn't know who this woman was. But whoever she was, she had just walked straight into a storm. "Do you believe in love at first sight? Or is Richard just acting out of desperation?" Grace Miller didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the luxurious guest bed in Richard Walker's penthouse, staring out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Chicago skyline. She didn't belong here. The sheets were too soft, the silence too deep. It was a far cry from the park bench she had curled up on just 48 hours ago. She kept replaying his words in her head. "I want to marry you." It wasn't just absurd, it was dangerous. In the early morning haze, she found herself in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee when Richard entered, dressed casually in a dark sweater and jeans, a stark contrast from the sharp suit he'd worn the night before. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "Did you sleep?" Grace didn't answer. "Why are you really doing this?" Richard hesitated. "I meant what I said. I made a vow, and I intend to keep it." "A vow?" She set the mug down a little harder than necessary. "To who? Your ego? Your legacy? Or is this just some performance to fix the hole in your heart?" The words stung more than he expected. "Maybe all of it," he admitted quietly. "But something happened when I saw you walk through that door. It wasn't just about the vow anymore." Grace folded her arms. "You don't even know who I am. That's why I want us to spend time together first. No pressure, no wedding bells tomorrow. Just let me get to know you. Let's see if this crazy thing has a heartbeat." She stared at him for a long beat, her guard still up. But something flickered in her curiosity, maybe even longing. "Fine," she said finally. "But I need my own place, not this tower." Richard grinned. Done. What followed was the strangest week of her life. He moved her into a modest but fully furnished apartment near Millennium Park. Comfortable, safe, nothing flashy. A wardrobe appeared tailored to her tastes, and etiquette lessons were gently offered, not imposed. But Grace, despite the strange tenderness of it all, kept her distance. She spent her mornings walking, her afternoons reading in cafes, and her nights wondering how long before the real motive revealed itself. Meanwhile, the headlines wouldn't die. "Billionaire walks the edge, new mystery. Woman in Walker's life is Grace Miller, the next Cinderella, or the ultimate scam." Lauren Walker saw every one of them, and every time something tightened in her chest. She hadn't seen Richard this animated in years, not even when their daughter Emily was born, and now he was chasing a woman he barely knew, ready to hand her the empire he once guarded with iron fists. She picked up the phone. "Daniel, I need to see her." Grace was sitting in a cafe when the woman appeared. Dark blonde hair, sharp blazer, confident steps. Grace knew instantly this wasn't just anyone. "You're Lauren," she said before the woman even spoke. Lauren sat across from her. "And you're Grace, the woman my ex-husband met on a dare and decided to rewrite his future for." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You came to warn me?" "No," Lauren said, surprising even herself. "I came to understand you, because if this is real, if you're serious, then you deserve to know what you're walking into." They sat there for an hour. Lauren didn't try to tear Richard down. She told stories of his ambition, his obsession with legacy, and the way that obsession destroyed everything good in his life, including her, including their marriage. Grace listened without interrupting. When Lauren stood to leave, she paused. "I don't hate you, Grace. I don't even blame you. But I need to know that you're not just a passing storm, because my daughter, she's watching." Grace's hands trembled as she lifted her cup again. Suddenly, this wasn't a bizarre fairy tale anymore. It was real. It had consequences. That same night, Grace knocked on Richard's office door. He was on a call but hung up when he saw her expression. "What's wrong?" She walked in slowly. "Your ex-wife came to see me." He blinked. "What?" "Why, she wanted to make sure I knew what I was stepping into." She wasn't angry, Richard. She was heartbroken. He stood rubbing the back of his neck. "Grace, I didn't mean to. I know she said cutting him off. But this is bigger than you, bigger than me. You've got a daughter, a legacy, a whole history I'm just crashing into." He stepped closer slowly. "You're not crashing. You're changing it," Grace's voice cracked. "I don't know if I can. I've spent years surviving, Richard, not living. And now you want me to just step into this glass world and pretend I belong?" "No," he whispered. "I don't want you to pretend. I want you to be exactly who you are." For the first time, she didn't flinch. But outside the door, Lauren waited in silence, watching through the glass. And she wasn't the only one watching. Because across the city in a dark office, an old man set down the newspaper headline with a bitter smile. "Richard Walker, always too sentimental," he muttered. Then he picked up the phone. "Activate the contingency plan. Let's shake the foundation of his perfect little fairy tale." What secret had Richard buried deep in his past, and what part of it was about to come knocking? How would you handle it if your ex showed up to confront your new partner, and they didn't try to fight but instead connected? Would that make you trust them more, or less? The call came just after midnight. Richard Walker stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city lights of Chicago stretching beneath him like veins of fire. In his hand was a glass of scotch untouched. His phone buzzed again. Third call from Daniel in less than an hour. When he finally answered, Daniel didn't waste time. "We've got a problem." "How bad?" Richard asked. "Board level bad. Someone's leaking financial records. They're trying to build a case that you've misused company funds to support Grace. And Richard, they're painting her as a gold digger, a scam artist." Richard's stomach sank. Daniel continued. "They're twisting everything. The apartment, the clothes, even that one night at the opera. They're claiming it was all funded by the company as part of a personal experiment. This isn't a smear campaign. This is a coup." Richard stared out at the skyline. He should have known this was coming. In his world, love wasn't allowed to look this messy, this real. "They're calling for an emergency board meeting tomorrow at noon, and they're demanding you step down." In a quiet cafe near Lakeview, Grace sat alone, her phone lighting up with headline after headline. Her heart pounded as she read the words, "Billionaire's romance sparks financial scandal. The fall of Richard Walker, seduced by a stranger, from park bench to penthouse." The truth about Grace Miller. She barely noticed Lauren Walker walk in and take the seat across from her. "I figured you'd be here," Lauren said quietly. Grace looked up, her expression unreadable. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Lauren replied, "but the world doesn't care. They want a villain. And you walked in at just the right time." Grace stared at her. "So why are you here?" "Because I've seen Richard make every mistake a man can make, but I've never seen him fight for someone the way he fights for you. And I know he's never needed help more than he does now." Grace's throat tightened. "I didn't ask for any of this. I just wanted a chance." "Then take it," Lauren said. "Not just for him, for you." The next morning, the Walker building was surrounded by reporters. The boardroom on the 36th floor was packed with cold suits and colder eyes. Richard stood at the head of the long table, his tie loosened, but his posture defiant. "I didn't misuse company funds. Everything spent came from my personal account. You brought chaos into this company," one board member sneered. "You made a mockery of our legacy." "I built this legacy," Richard shot back. "And maybe you've forgotten, but it was built on risk, on doing what others wouldn't dare." Before anyone could respond, the door swung open. Grace walked in. Gasps rippled across the room as cameras clicked outside. Her voice was calm. I know I wasn't invited, but I need to speak. One of the members protested. This is private board business. She's staying, Richard said firmly. Grace looked at every person in the room. I don't want Richard's money. I don't want his empire. I didn't ask for him to pull me out of the shadows. But he did, and for weeks I kept thinking he'd change his mind once he saw who I really was. She paused. He didn't. He just kept showing up. There was silence. I'm not the fairy tale you wanted, and I don't want to pretend to be. But I am honest. I've slept on sidewalks. I've been hungry. I've been invisible. And I would rather go back to that life than stand here and let you tear him apart for loving someone who didn't come from a country club. A long beat passed. Then the oldest board member leaned forward. Miss Miller, if you're not after money and you're not after fame, why are you still here? Grace turned to Richard. Because I love him, but also because, for the first time in my life, someone believed I was enough. Not pretty enough, not rich enough, just enough. That was the moment everything shifted. The board voted, and against all odds, Richard kept his seat, on the condition that he step back from day-to-day operations and appoint a co-director. He chose Emily, his daughter. 3 months later, Grace stood in Lincoln Park in a simple white dress, the golden autumn leaves swirling around her. There were no TV cameras, no luxury gowns, no PR teams, just friends, family, the people who had stayed. Richard stood beside her in a gray suit, eyes soft, hands steady. Daniel gave a speech so unexpectedly heartfelt, it left half the guests misty-eyed. Lauren stood beside Emily, who wore a dusty rose dress and held the wedding rings in her palm. When the minister asked if Grace took Richard as her husband, she laughed, not mockingly, just a sound of pure disbelief at how far they'd come. I do, she whispered. After the vows, as the reception carried into sunset, Richard and Grace slipped away to a small bench beneath the trees. No one followed. I still can't believe this happened, Grace said, leaning into him. Neither can I, Richard replied. But I'd do it all again, even the scandals, even the headlines, if it meant getting to this. She looked at him, her eyes full of something that had taken root beyond survival peace. They didn't live in a penthouse anymore. They moved into a modest brownstone near Wicker Park. Grace refused to give up her job at the women's shelter. Richard started teaching one night a week at a local college, Introduction to Legacy Finance, rewritten with soul. Together, they launched the Grace Initiative, a nonprofit supporting job training and transitional housing for women who had been through what Grace had. One day, Lauren dropped off a donation envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. You didn't just save Richard, you saved all of us. Thank you. Lauren, in time, even the headlines changed, not billionaires fall, but Grace rises. Now we'd love to hear from you. What did this story mean to you? Do you believe second chances like this are possible in real life? If you enjoyed the journey of Grace and Richard, comment 100 below and tell us which country you're watching from. And if you believe that love is worth fighting for even when the odds are impossible, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes it's not where you come from that defines you, it's where you dare to go.